Right, currently in universities and what have you, there's a, well, I think it's a fairly welcome call to decolonise universities. And I think there's been an issue that you tend to have universities where the ideas that are put across, and often the people who are putting them across, are older white men, often with beards, and that this is a problem, and you need to start looking at ideas from a different set of people and backgrounds. Now, in the context of this, it's been fitting in with challenging all sorts of ideas about conservative, racist, sexist views and so on that tend to be put across. We're challenging the fact that you still have the lionisation of people like Cecil Rhodes, because there's been a campaign against the fact that there's still statues of him up at Oxford universities and Rhodes scholarships and so on going on, when he was one of the biggest racist imperialists who was set about the involvement in conquering Africa. So there's an understandable call to challenge these kind of ideas. Now, one of the things that I'm less happy about is the fact that often Marx gets caught up in this, and people say, well, Karl Marx, he may have been able to talk about certain sorts of oppression, perhaps workers' oppression, and certain sorts of things perhaps to do with economics, but he wasn't someone who was able to talk about what it was like being poor, and he wasn't someone, I mean, in the Third World, he wasn't someone who was able to talk about racism. And I think that one thing that's happened over the past 20 or 30 years is that as arguments about the old white men have taken up, it's become almost a common sense that Marx wasn't in a position to talk about these things, that Marx was actually someone who was very weak on a lot of these issues, and it's something that has been challenged a lot. Now, I think I mentioned the decolonise the universities thing that's going on recently, but these ideas have come up for a long time in a number of different forms. Probably the most famous before this was with the writer Edward Said, who wrote a book in Orientalism, published in 1978, which talked about the way that people in the West tend to view the rest of the world, which as the Orient, which was a very powerful polemic about the way that it's assumed that things that happen in the West and the history of the West is right, and that everything else is just a pale reflection of it. More recently, you've had the term Eurocentrism used, which is a thing which looks at the way that the world is viewed and says it's viewed very much from how things look in London or in one of the Western capitals, and it doesn't take an interest in what things are like for people who live in other bits of the world. It assumes that the natural way to be is the way that things are if you're normally one of the rulers in a Western capital. And I think that this is the kind of thing that a lot of ideas about Marx have been caught up in. And I think that this is interesting for a number of reasons. One is that the term Eurocentrism was originally coined in the 1970s by a theoretician called Samir Amin. It's worth mentioning him because he was a Marxist theoretician. So he's not someone who would have said that you should dismiss Marx as one of these people who had nothing to say about people in other parts of the world. Also, worth mentioning, I'm not going to say very much about the beginnings of this argument and the arguments around Edward Said and Orientalism, except to say that while I think Orientalism is a very powerful book that people should read, it's absolutely at its weakest when it's talking about Marx. And I'll talk briefly about I'm going to go back to what is Eurocentrism. I'll come back to what Orientalism does in a minute. What is Eurocentrism? Because I think you have to start by sort of defining the terms a bit. I've sort of said it's the idea that you have to view everything from Europe. But a lot of things that have happened over history are about the development of ideas. And if you look at particularly Marx's project was to explain the emergence of capitalism. Why have you got this new system which is taking over the world? If you're going to do that, if you're going to start looking at the emergence and development of capitalism, you have to start from the fact that capitalism developed in Europe, and therefore look at how things developed in Europe. So this is where a lot of people, the starting point is. It's also the starting point for a lot of people who are looking at capitalism, if you like, people who are supporters of capitalism, because they tend to say, this is good, there's something wonderful about Europe, which means that we have developed things in a way that other parts of the world haven't. And this is what I would think of as part of the Enlightenment project. You start seeing people emerging in the 18th century who are seeing Europe starting to pull ahead economically of other bits of the world, and are starting to say, this is because of something peculiarly wonderful about Europe. Now there's a contradiction here. Exactly the same people who were talking about the specialness of Europe were also the people who were starting to talk about ideas of equality and the idea that there aren't a simple hierarchy of different sorts of people. And this was a contradiction. It's one of the things that Samir Amin said he coined the term. He wrote a book in the 1980s called Eurocentrism, and he said Enlightenment culture confronted a real contradiction that it could not overcome by its own means. For it was self-evident that nascent capitalism, which had produced the Enlightenment, had unfolded in Europe. Moreover, this embryonic new world was in fact superior both materially and in many other aspects to earlier societies in its own territory, feudal Europe, and in other regions of the world, such as the Islamic Orient. He goes on about that at some length. So that it's I think that they're starting to see that they're more economically advanced. The mention of the Islamic Orient as in that sense is quite important, because if you look back to earlier European models and European ruling classes self-images of themselves, they couldn't do this, we're simply superior, because actually until this point, mostly the Islamic societies in the Middle East and so on had been obviously more advanced technologically and intellectually often and things. You know, the fact that we get a lot of maths and things was developed in the Islamic world was because they were these societies for a long time were technically more advanced. But you start seeing with the emergence of capitalism, the European societies pushing ahead. And then you have the question, which was implied, I think, in what it was saying there from what Armin had said, which was, why is this? And Armin puts it in terms of saying Eurocentrism rests upon teleology, namely that the entire history of Europe necessarily led to the blossoming of capitalism. It's a slightly confusing way of putting it, but what he's saying is that there is the European theoreticians tend to say there's something particularly wonderful about Europe, which leads to thinking whether it's the Protestant work ethic, which is the way that it's put, or something else, which says that these things had to happen in Europe. It was that you cannot look at other societies and think that these societies would have developed. There's something superior about Europe. And then at this point it starts fitting in with racist ideas and the ideas that developed through the 18th and 19th century, that there was something inherently superior about Europeans and specific sorts of Europeans, often the Anglo-Saxons or the Scandinavians, but I don't want to go into that particularly. So, given that this argument, it's an argument about something that emerged at a particular point, sort of in the 18th century and onwards. Just one last point. This is something that Said talks about quite a lot in his book Orientalism, though he becomes very vague. He sometimes talks about the emergence of these ideas in the 18th century with the rise of capitalism. He sometimes talks about it emerging in ancient Greece as a long-term division, and I think that this is some of the weaknesses of the argument that he puts. But I'm not going to say any more about him. I want to follow through the idea that you see Europe as being essential and the ideas could only develop in Europe. Because how does this work fit with Marx? Because the main point I want to make is that I don't think Marx is a Eurocentric thinker, and I think that, that there's a couple of reasons for not believing this. Firstly, I want to say a couple of things about Marx. Some of them follow on from the kinds of things Alex was saying in the previous session. Firstly, Marx as a thinker was someone who developed right the way through his life, and he changed some of what he was thinking. I'm going to argue that he evolved in what he was thinking. Some people say that he had sections where he abandoned entire things. I think that it was more the case that his ideas evolved over time. And these led to certain changes in the kinds of attitudes that he was making, that he had. But I also think that there's something which will be quite important, so I'm going to sort of hammer it several times, which is the arguments that oppose Marx's view are sometimes things that are worried about there being too much dominance of European individuals and European ideas. They're also sometimes things that are objecting to the idea of there being a single narrative of history. Marx's idea that you can start looking at history and understand it by looking at how different societies developed over different times. People will start saying that actually to look for a grand narrative like that is to oversimplify history, and therefore the whole Marxist project is wrong from beginning to end. This is something which is put across by people who often talk about Marx talking too much about power being in one place, talking about the working class developing and so on, and actually power is decentralised. I'll come back to that in a bit. These are ideas which are put across by particularly people like Foucault and so on, who have become who later ideas, who a lot of the people who are calling Marx Eurocentric look to in their analysis. Should say that a lot of the people, these arguments have become more popular in the period, the same period that for people who were in the last session that Alex was talking about, when there's been a rejection of a lot of the ideas of Marxism. So through the 80s and 90s, people who had once looked to Marxist ideas and now started rejecting them and were looking for a reason why their vision of what Marxist ideas would do didn't happen. This is true of a book which I'd like to say more about, probably won't have a lot of time, Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, who was someone who was talking about how fascinating it is that through the 20th century, lots of the best black fighters became Marxists, but then moved away from it and often moved into certain forms of Pan-Africanism or so on. He looked at this as a failure in Marxism. More recently, particularly in India and around there, you've had the development of a series of arguments often called Subaltern Studies or post-colonialism, which start looking at saying there was a failure in Marx's understanding of how society developed, and you need something which rejects Marxism and says that you have to look at peculiarities in different structures in each individual society, and therefore you can't have the kind of united grand narrative that Marx talked about. And just to say, in terms of views of looking at Marx as Eurocentric, I think it's interesting I was just looking at the London Review of Books, which has an article this week by Tariq Ali, who's looking at the development of, he's talking about 1968, so he's talking about when he came to Britain, and he said when he arrived, he became a member of the International Marxist Group, and he was surprised in the 1960s to find, I quote, "The other Trotskyist groups in Britain just amazed me because they never accepted there was a socialist revolution in China or Vietnam or Cuba or anywhere. It was just 1917, which for someone coming from Asia was a huge shock, and revealed a narrow-minded Eurocentric provincialism." So his argument is that unless you accept that there are different kinds of revolutions, different ways for Marxism to develop, so that you've got to say, yes, you have 1917 in Russia, you also have the revolution in China, you also have the other revolutions that called themselves Marxist round the world, you are being Eurocentric, because you're not accepting the different challenges there. And I think it's interesting to put that because it shows that these arguments happen within contexts. And the point I want to make, going back to Marx, is to say that what he was doing was firstly analysing capitalism. The reason that he had to analyse capitalism in Europe was because this was where capitalism existed at the time. It was something that was developing. It started developing in Northern Europe. What he wanted to do was look at how society developed, how capitalism had developed, and he particularly picked on Britain as the most advanced capitalist country. So he was looking at capitalism developing in Britain. He was later, and he wrote several times, when I said, you know, you have slave society going to feudal society, going into capitalist society, I wasn't saying that this was the only way things could develop. He was saying that I was looking at Britain and how things had developed here. But having said that, he was also saying, talking about a society that had become dynamic and was moving out and taking over the world. So he was talking about how this society came to be so dynamic. And as a quote someone else who's come in on this, a theorist called Ajaz Ahmed, who wrote a book called In Theory, which said, which was defending Marxism against some of the these attacks on it, where he said there have historically been all sorts of processes connected with class and gender, ethnicity and religion, xenophobia and bigotry, which have unfortunately been at work in all human societies, both European and non-European. What gave European forms of these prejudices their special force in history was the power of colonial capitalism. So the fact that Europe is expanding out is because capitalism was powerful. Marx is trying to explain why capitalism is powerful. Having said that, he's often attacked for looking at other societies and looking at them as not being able to compete. So if you look at some of the journalism, his journalism is very interesting and powerful on a lot of things. But in 1853, he wrote some journalist reports on India. And one of the things he said was that India would be drawn in to modern society by the British occupation. Therefore, this would allow Indians to take part in their own liberation. Now, I think it's quite important. Often this is reported as if he was saying the progressive thing, the wonderful thing that was going on was the British occupation. What he was saying was that by being drawn into the capitalist system, he thought that that would develop a working class which would then be able to overthrow the capitalist system. So people would have the ability to overthrow the system and liberate themselves. But he was certainly appeared to be saying at that point that you needed capitalism in order to advance. And he was talked often, he occasionally in his early writings, talked about Oriental despotism and later on the Asiatic mode of production. Now, this was a way of saying that there were different ways that society developed, but he saw this as a stagnant way and one that had to be overcome. Lots of people say because he used the words Asiatic and Oriental that this is a sign that he was an Orientalist and was someone who said that the people in other parts of the world had to be saved from themselves. I don't think that this is true, and I haven't really got time to go through in much depth about that, so we might want to bring it up in the discussion. Because one of the things about the way what he was talking about society was capitalism developing against other societies. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about capitalism being more dynamic than previous Asiatic societies, we're also talking about capitalism being more dynamic than previous European societies. So it wasn't a thing of saying that Europe is wonderful and other places aren't. It was a thing about talking about why capitalism was dynamic, and he was always looking, as in the Communist Manifesto, just about the contradictions in capitalism, that on the one hand it develops the means of production so there's more wealth about, and on the other hand it does it by crushing people and destroying societies around the world. In these circumstances, I think you have to be able to look at both sides, because people sometimes say, oh, he was supporting what the capitalists were doing. I don't think that this is true, and it's also the case that people tend to look at these articles from 1853. By the time you get to the Indian Uprising of 1857, he's absolutely clear that you don't just sit back as you see capitalism expanding and put up with it until such a time as it's developed you should fight back. So he absolutely supported the uprising in India against the British, and was absolutely contemptuous of people who talked about the backward nature of the sepoys who were rising up, and said, you want to look at brutal violence. Look at what the British have been doing around the world. Before long, not long after this was the period which Alex mentioned of the American Civil War, where again he saw how vitally important it was for other groups of people, particularly oppressed people such as slaves, to be drawn in and to be fighting. And he saw the fight against racism as being absolutely key in the way that you defeat capitalism. So I want to say that he was moving along as he was developing his ideas and seeing that the roles of other people and other sections of society were really important in how society and how his ideas developed. Now, one thing Alex mentioned earlier on was that Marx was always late for everything. One of the things he was always late at was publishing things. And there's a reason for this, which was a bit of a perfectionist. He would read what he'd written and think, I should check some more facts, I should read some more about that, I need to find out more about these things, and then go off and write a bigger, longer book. And you get lots of letters from Engels saying, will you please get on with it and publish this book? We need something published. I think we're lucky that Engels nagged him, because he probably would never have got Volume 1 of Capital published if Engels hadn't gone on nagging him. But it's interesting to see that throughout his life, he has enormous numbers of notebooks which he kept, and one thing that's happened was the, I don't know if academics call it this, but the mega project, which is the project of publishing all of Marx and Engels' works, is an ongoing thing because people find new things. What's interesting about it is partly that if you go through his notebooks, you can start seeing ideas that he was developing and see why he put the things in what he published. I think this is important for two reasons. Firstly, Lucia Pradella has just recently published stuff which talks about his notebooks when he was preparing Capital, which talk about his understanding of globalization and the importance of the role that different countries took in it. And secondly, as his ideas developed, he became more and more interested in societies outside Europe. Now, since the 1980s, there's been an interest in some later societies that he related to, and specifically, in this case, to Russia. He was interested in Russia, which was developing as a capitalist society, while you still had areas where peasants held land in common. And Marxism became very popular in Russia. It was the first language that Capital was translated into from German was Russian, and it was appeared in Russia. And I was going to say famously, probably not that famously, he received a letter from a Russian comrade who said, I've been reading what you said about the development of capitalism, and what about the Russian commune? Because this seems to be different from the way things happened in Western Europe. And he said that he wrote a letter back. In fact, he wrote a whole series of drafts of the letters. Again, his notebooks, where he said that actually he thought that things could develop differently, and he thought that you wouldn't have to go through all the stages if you have a collective organisation like the commune was there. It might be possible for that to advance straight through into socialism. Now, some people get very excited about this and say that this means that he'd changed his ideas about how things were organised and was talking about how peasants could just organise and move straight from a peasant society through into socialism. If you read his relatively brief letter that he wrote to Vera Susalich, was the Russian he was writing to, what he said was, if you have revolution in advanced places, which would link across countries, so you have revolution going on in different places, then other places would not need to go through all the stages. So the argument that he was putting was an argument that people would recognise from later on as an argument for permanent revolution, which is saying that you can have combined and uneven development. Because of the uneven development, you don't have to go through all the stages in every place. I think this is quite an important argument, because it both says that he was interested in other societies, and it says that he was not bogged down in the idea that everything had to develop in the way that it had in Europe. I think that this is one of the things people say in his last decade, Marx didn't publish it. We published a couple of things, but none of the major things. And some people have sort of said, oh, he was burnt out, having spent so much time doing notes for Capital and so on, and then organising the First International. But it seems that actually one of the things he was doing was broadening his scope. So he was doing an awful lot of reading, both about things like the Russian Commune, but also things like the writings that were going on about societies outside Europe. Things like Morgan, which Engels would write about in The Origins of the Family and so on, which looked at different ways of organising society. Marx wrote enormous numbers of notes on this, and I think one of the things that was happening was he was trying to fit all this within his wider view of how things should be organised. So my main argument, therefore, is no, Marx wasn't caught up in an idea that you had to follow Europe and that Europe was in some way more advanced. And if you, Edward Said overtly says that Marx said that people from the Orient, that's everywhere other than Europe, had to be saved by Europeans. This wasn't what he was saying. He was arguing that as capitalism developed, it allowed people to actually advance society, that you could, and if people took over the means of production, that would allow them to advance society into socialism, and that would be something that didn't rely on Europeans. So he was looking at different ways of organising people in society. But there's a couple of other things that follow on from this. Firstly, you have to look at how Marx's ideas have been taken up and followed on. I think I haven't really got time to talk about everything that happened since, but certainly in terms of Lenin's analysis of imperialism, in terms of Trotsky's analysis of things to do with combined and uneven development, these things are the reasons why it was that once you had the Bolshevik Revolution and its anti-racist, anti-imperialist, the fact that it was both these things, it inspired people around the world. So you started seeing people saying, I will support Bolshevism, and then more and more people got involved. And this is why you start seeing people across the world, from China to people in the southern states of America, black sharecroppers saying, we will look to Bolshevism. And it's amazing to see how many people were inspired by that. The thing which I think some of the people I mentioned before, people who were disappointed in communism later on looked at, was there was something wrong in the Marxist ideas, because what happened in what we would call the Stalinist states was disappointing. I think that that was not to do with what was something inherently wrong in Marxism. It was something that was a problem with the way it developed under Stalinism. And the reason that I think this is important now is because if you decide that Marx was part of the problem, if you decide that he was one of the old European men who said you have to just listen to white European men, and he had nothing to say about liberation, nothing to say about oppression, and so on, it leads you to a position of rejecting Marxism, or saying perhaps Marxism is useful, but it's useful as one of a number of things. It's not useful on its own. It's not useful in terms of offering a theory of liberation. And I think it does offer a theory of liberation because it shows how things are connected together. The people who follow Foucault and talk about decentering power and say that you have to just look at race over here or gender or other things and it's all decentered, lose an idea of changing the whole of society. And I think one of the things that often comes up with a lot of the arguments that about race and oppression that come up, particularly in universities at the moment, is an idea that you have to look at each thing individually, and also people have to look very much to their own individual things. So racism becomes a thing about different ways of oppression. Sometimes it's talked about as a binary in terms of black people and white people, and sometimes it's talked about in terms of different groups of oppressed people who have to find their own interests, so that you have to say that people who suffer racism who are Asian have different interests from people who are African Caribbean, and so on, different divisions, that there's no common interest between, say, Romanians or Irish people who are suffering racism and people from an African, Caribbean background. And these kind of divisions can keep going on because it reverses the way that Marx would have looked at the issue, which is talking about why oppression develops, why these oppressions such as racism come up with capitalism. And that means that the oppressed people actually have a unity of interests. I think that the real danger of the theories which reject Marx's analysis and reject the way that Marx looked at things is that it denies there being a unity of interest between people, and not just a unity of interest in the fact that everyone feels oppressed, but a unity of interest in the fact that because people are exploited, it means that they have power to come together and actually challenge these things, which I think was one of the beautiful things in what Trevor was saying in the previous session. So for those reasons, I think it's important to defend what Marx was saying and defend Marx as someone who was supporting and showing a path to the liberation, not just of European workers, but of workers, peasants and women and all of society, not just in Europe, but around the world.